Hello and welcome to Power, People and Planet. My name is Kumi Naidu, and this is a series of conversations with activists and leaders around the world about some of the most pressing challenges that humanity currently faces. Today, I'm really excited to have two people who have inspired me a lot in recent times, and in one case for a very long time, in what they've done through their activism. The first is Clare Farrell, an active citizen devoting a creativity, energy, and occasionally own personal freedom to fight against climate collapse and the wider environmental crisis. She's also a fashion designer and a lecturer, which many people don't know about, and she has been arrested numerous times for her climate activism. As one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, she helps coordinate a mass movement of people using non-violent civil disobedience to ensure that we can save this planet for current and future generations. I'm also joined by Marta Benavides. She's a theologian, ordained minister, permaculturalist, educator, and artist. A leader of an ecumenical revolution focused on bringing peace to her country, El Salvador. The ordained pastor who chose to live and not die for the revolution has been bringing people from all fields to defend human rights and develop a culture of peace. She worked closely with Archbishop Oscar Romero, who was assassinated in 1980, which would see her go into exile into Mexico and the United States, but she returned immediately to El Salvador in 1992 after the peace accords. Clare, Marta, thank you so much for speaking to me today about the topic of civil disobedience. So I'm going to turn to you, Clare, first. In this current moment of multiple crises that people are facing in the world, what is the place of civil disobedience today from your perspective?
Well, thanks for having me, and it's really great to meet you, Marta. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about how we frame the need to disobey and the need to break laws. For me, anyway, living in the UK and knowing our sort of history and our culpability in creating the conditions that see the planet in a kind of global state of existential crisis, is what do you do when your society and your way of life is actually in effect a crime against humanity? People I think are struggling very much with the climate and ecological crisis in movements like XR in countries like the UK, because we know that we are responsible and we know that what we do is making everything worse. And so in some senses where people have said to us, it would make more sense for you to go and dismantle an oil rig than to go and sit on a bridge. We have to then talk about what it means to take civil disobedience in a way which includes some kind of a universal disruption, because there is a universality and an enormity to the thing we're facing. And at the same time, people understand very much more those kinds of good people break bad laws. Well, what law do you break by sitting in the road? You don't break a bad law necessarily. You break the law of being in someone's way. And that doesn't make quite so much sense as doing those sort of targeted kind of like stopping industry or stopping a project or doing that sort of resistance. But I think there's room for like multiple different types, because there is so much wrong, and because we're, a lot of us, all very implicated in richer countries, particularly by the ways that we live our lives, the way that we power our homes, the ways that we power our cars, the way that the things that we eat, the way we import our food, the clothes that we wear. So to me, there's sort of emerging, now that we're sort of at the later stages of XR, after we've been doing this for a few years, there's kind of several layers to the disobedience, which is to do with not just disobeying the laws that you see as wrong, but also to disobey the social norms, which then say to people, actually, there's a problem here and it's very, very big. And it's to do with our governance. It's to do with our decision making. It's to do with our politics. It's to do with our way of life. to me now it's becoming sort of clear that it's much more multi-layered than perhaps the conversation kind of implied when we first launched the movement. But I'd love to know what Marta thinks, because sounds like she's been thinking about it for a bit longer than I have.
Well, a little bit longer. In fact, Marta, I'd like you to pick up that response to Claire, but let me just point out to our listeners and viewers that actually we were talking earlier and we figured out that we got one of the most intergenerational podcast panels we'll have. We figured there's a 20-year age gap between all three of us, roughly speaking. So you're getting 3 generations of reflection on the question of civil disobedience. So Marta, respond to Claire's question to you. What's your take?
It is intergenerational and intercultural and international. This is very good. This might sound kind of crazy to many people, but I come from a background. I look very white, but I come from Columbus getting lost and calling us Indians. And so when I get to meet people from India and I say, I'm an Indian that is not from India. And then they say, what that? And then I tell them, well, Columbus got lost, What? Columbus got lost? Yes, he didn't discover us, No, we found him almost dead in our coast, and then we fed him and cured him and everything. And then he said, I discover you. And then he said, and because of that, now I have the right, in the name of the church and in the name of the queen, to take over. And we didn't know what that was, And he was talking in Spanish anyway, and we didn't speak that language, but he took over, because we came from a background that was very different. We didn't come from that mentality, and I am still not in that mentality. That's how I grew up. So I think that, I have always been disobedient, not in the way that my mom, she would tell me that I was very rebellious because I wouldn't want to do this or the other. But as a family and as peoples in general, in my country, we have never accepted what has been given to us. And many times when people meet us, they say, oh, you're Latin, you're too emotional, you're always thinking about conspiracy. And we say, no, everybody's conspiring against us, taking everything from us. So you see, for us to talk about this is very, very important. And I am thankful that Kumi has thought about this, because this is the time that we have to really think about why we are where we are at now, why we are doing what we are doing, and what are the various ways of resistance. So because in our case, we had to resist, but we have to think of, being able to do the thing for the long haul, And so we are not talking so much about civil disobedience, but about character and integrity and a sense of justice, and that is what makes us be rebellious, because we know that everything is very unjust. And so when we hear people talking in some ways, we say, no, but, we don't have to be civil. I tell you a story, like people in the North, they have hunger strikes, against, laws and situations. And I was translating to one of my friends that Kumi knows, and at the time, and he said, what are they saying? And I said that they are going to have a hunger strike about what's happening in the world, about all these wars. No. He said, don't have a hunger strike. We are very hungry. We haven't eaten for centuries. So we always see from this, from down top, always turning everything around.
Marta.
So we're going to have a very good discussion, because I've been really thinking and losing sleep about how to do what we have to do. And when we discuss longer, in this conversation, I will be able to say the ways that we are doing it. But that doesn't mean that what the people of the North and Clare is doing is not good. It's just that we got to match each other, so we know that it's really about the same thing.
Thank you so much, Marta. And I think you put your finger on one issue. Let's just take that up, Claire, which is civil disobedience, like any other form of political action, is deeply contextual. What works well in one place might not necessarily work well in another place. By the way, the example you gave me about hunger strike, I encountered it when I joined Greenpeace in 2009. We were just going into the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, and in the run-up to it, there were some people in the global south within Greenpeace was suggesting that there should be there's some people from the north who were suggesting hunger strikes, but there were also people from the south, like in India and so on, who were also suggesting it. And there was a real major cultural difference between the north and the south in the way the conversation transpired, because also some people saw a hunger strike as an act of self-violence and, in some complicated theories and so on. So I think the way you put it, Marta, is exactly right, that we have to respect the diversity of the different contexts that we all find ourselves in, and which are getting more complex as we move forward. But we have to figure out how they fit in. So, Clare, if I can just throw that question to you, how does the different political spaces that we have in different parts of the world, especially at a time when we're trying to build international actions, because we know climate change doesn't recognize borders, how do we address this question of different contexts, especially in terms of political space, of what can actually happen or can't happen?
Well, it's a huge question, isn't it? I mean, take a hunger strike, for example. I've been on hunger strike only for 2 weeks. And it seemed at the time like a very radical thing to do. And to do that facing the British Labour Party, which lots of people thought was outrageous because they're at least supposed to be, on our side in some respects. And we thought at the time that there was something interesting about it because of the context. So there was a vote in Parliament that was going to happen to secure the expansion of Heathrow Airport as a government policy, which would be then very difficult to remove. We went to them and said, if you don't enforce as much power as possible on your party to vote against this, then you are encouraging your party to be complicit in a crime against humanity. This is going to cause a global genocide. This is unacceptable with the information available. And we're going on hunger strike to make a huge deal out of it. And there will be a big group of us and we'll sit outside your office and we'll do that. And of course, they tried to talk us out of it, but we went ahead and did it anyway. And I learned a lot from doing that, partly because of what it did to us as a small group of people who did it, but also about the way that the media engaged with us, which was not much at all. The way that the people in politics dealt with us, which was not very much at all, apart from to try and tell us not to do it. And the majority of the impact came, for me anyway, to friends and family, people who were worried about me, people who turned to me and said, I'm very worried about you doing this, and I think you might be mad, and I think you might die, and I don't know if you're going to lose it. And, that gave me an opportunity to turn to the people that I did know and say, you're worried about me, worry about this. And that was actually one of the most powerful sort of parts of that action for me, was that it actually was very personal. And so it started to show to me how, the combination of things in the context can decide whether or not anyone pays attention. So one person in the UK who went on hunger strike for much longer and almost died, eventually managed to get some movement, to get, whose name is Angus, to get a briefing in the government on climate, which almost nobody attended, right? So it was enough to make him not kill himself through refusing to eat. But the outcome was also politically completely negligible. And again, almost no press coverage. And we have a media in Britain that basically says, if you get really ill or you die, then we'll cover it. If something horrible happens, we'll cover it. But otherwise, it's not really a story, or we're not really interested. And at the same time, when you have somebody who, for example, is held hostage and their partner is on hunger strike to try and get the government to arrange to bring them home from another country, sometimes because of the story, then that hunger strike gets a lot of attention. even if it's the person has said, I've got no intention of doing this until I die. So there's no drama in what they're doing. They're basically on a fast. So it's interesting to me that I always thought that the risk that you put yourself in is an important component part of nonviolence. And in that, if you do choose to engage in a hunger strike, you go on hunger strike and you basically say to your opponent, okay, my life is entirely in your hands. Entirely. Here you go, have it, take it. And that's the power of it, because your power is your vulnerability. But actually, if nobody will talk about it, and if nobody really is sort of engaged in your vulnerability, if nobody's interested in that vulnerability because your life doesn't matter, then you have a problem. And so right now, I think contextually, it's interesting how devalued life is in so many places. Absolutely. And how the quality of our lives is devalued in so many places. And it's almost, it's unsurprising in a culture like a post-colonial or still colonial country like Britain that lives are not valued, right? Because we have a long history of like not valuing lives. And so, of course, you turn around and go, oh, no, they don't care about me now. Well, what did you expect, like, so I think the context for me, which is hard now, is the devaluation of life and of biodiversity and like biological life on Earth, all of the things that are alive, and somehow finding ways to exert the work of nonviolence and civil disobedience that holds up like something about the sacred. Because I would say that there is little that is sacred in the culture that I live in, unless it's banknote, or if it's figures in someone's bank account. That really feels like the only thing. So I think that's one of the contexts that we're up against, and it's a mighty design challenge to put yourself in the context repeatedly, because also our political context has changed here so much. Overnight we have an unelected leader, and overnight we have an unelected new monarch, and everything's different now than it was a few weeks ago.
Absolutely.
Slightly different, but it's different,
But what is common, Clare, from what you said, and you've put your finger on one of the most important challenges for those of us who are seeking to have a world of sanity and climate justice and sustainability and peace, is that we've got a media system that is completely stacked against us. And by the way, it's not just the Murdoch press in the UK, which I'm familiar with, that, basically only the Conservatives can win unless Labour sells itself out as the Tony Blair government did and became completely neoliberal and acted just as bad as the Conservatives did fundamentally for us in the global South. Even though the words were different, their actions fundamentally were the same. So I just want to flag the question of civil disobedience in the media that I'd like to come to. But Marta, on a lighter note, I was just wanting to say to you, when you invoked Columbus, my favorite NGO joke I heard from a Scottish activist where he said he was speaking to a group of business people in Scotland, and he was saying how important NGOs are. And at the end of his speech, somebody put up his hand and said, you're going on and on about NGOs this and NGOs that. What exactly is the definition of NGOs? So Martin Syme, this friend of mine, responded by saying, well, listen, to understand NGOs, all you have to do is understand Christopher Columbus. Because when he set off, he didn't know exactly where he was going. When he arrived, he didn't know exactly where he was. When he got back, he didn't know exactly where he had been, but he had a huge impact on the world, and he did it all on somebody else's money. So I wanted to just end that contextual point by just bringing it in a very simple way first, right? Like, from my experience working with Marta in the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, for example, when we're doing that stand up and speak out against poverty and inequality campaigns, over those 5-6 years that we did that, one of the things that became so clear, we were trying to organize in China, we were trying to organize in, all the sort of countries who most so-called international or global movements never tried to mobilize in. And we found ways of reading where the culture was and finding ways in which we can open up participation. So, for example, in China, we were able to work with the organization working with Chinese living with disabilities, and they were able to participate in the campaign, for example. But just put it very simply, if you take an act of civil disobedience such as mooning, do you know what's mooning, Marta? I can wait.
No.
Clare is smiling. I know she knows what mooning is. Mooning is like, for example, three of us and few other friends. We can get together and on each of our bum cheek we write one letter. So we can write climate justice now, but we then pull down our pants in public and we show our bums, and then you can read the slogan. Now that might work well in California, maybe in London, maybe in New York, maybe in Paris, but you know for sure that's not going to work well in Saudi Arabia, in Indonesia, and a few other places, right? So just to close that point, this is the importance of not underestimating the different contexts in which we have to deploy the acts of civil disobedience. Marta, I'd like to come to you now in response to the big issue that Clare put a finger on. How important is the fact that we've got a communications framework and a media system that's completely stacked against us? And might I say, when you dig deeper, it's also things like the funding of arts and culture, right, is also stacked against us because it's usually things which are so-called high culture, just museums and, big things, which are important, but people forget culture is the life that people lead and so on. So things are stacked against us because I put it to you, why is it? You've been around the longest from three of us, right? You've seen so much of struggles. You've seen close comrades, being killed and so on. Why is it that in a world where all the opinion polls say that now about 60 to 75% of people want climate justice and climate action, majorities want women to have the right to choose, majorities actually don't want the level of inequality that we have between rich and poor at the moment and all of that. Why is it when we have these majorities in so many places, how is it that we are not able to get urgency on the issue of climate in particular, as well as the intersecting issues of inequality and so on? Why are we failing and what can we do about it, Marta? Since you're the most senior amongst us, you get the most difficult question.
I'm not the most serious. I just laugh at a lot of things, because we always looking from the bottom up. This is the thing for us. We always know that, like, for example, we created a civil coalition in the United States when I was a student, and I became the chairperson. And I said, yeah, that's good. And, we were relating it to some of the words of some of the leaders, government leaders at the time that were talking about, being the third world and not necessarily first and second world. So that was an act of resistance in a sense. But I was telling them, I'm going along with it, but I am not third world. But I know that we are the two third worlds of the world. You see? And talking about that, people kept saying, but what are you talking about? And okay, look at the people around the world. The society that is, or the culture that is the dominant culture, is really belonging to the people that invaded us. And we shouldn't necessarily be against them and hate them, but we should know what happened. See, that's one thing that is important, to know exactly what happened and how and why, and where is it taking us, and how is it that they keep us, obedient. So, for example, in our countries, it is on purpose that when the colonizers took over and they did the conquest, they were never really able to conquer us. But they colonized us enough, to force us to do certain things. And so at this point, the major issue is that in the majority of countries, through the colonizing and the conquest, in some of the countries, they forced us to be slaves because we were not the kind of people that wanted the same kind of thing that the colonizers wanted. And so we were always getting out of the way, out of how they wanted us to be. And so, for example, right now, I keep saying that the reason that the people in my country are the majority supporting an administration of government, and this is why language is so important, is the administration of government, not the government. The president is somebody that is paid, a citizen that is paid to preside over the administration. And we should say it. And people that are colonized enough said, we cannot say that because he's the president. How do you dare look down on him? Because it's usually a he. And we say, no, he's one of us. And we are paying him. He's our employee. Just saying that and bringing it everywhere, and calling the Mr. President, Señor Presidente. No, not even God is Señor. Who invented that? God is not also King of Kings. Who is that? I cannot really look at what happened, like in England, in the UK, the United Kingdom. And I know that all those people in the Caribbean, they are not united on that, And it is there where all those paradises to put the money that they want to keep out of of their communities is there. So, we start calling other names, and that's an act of resistance to be able to see through. But that has to be taught, That's critical thinking for critical action. And so it's not to be just criticism, but to know. To know is important. And for example, in my case, I am the oldest of 4 daughters. My mom said to my dad, these are 4 girls. I want them to be whole human beings. I don't want them to just be waiting for somebody to marry them. And then she told us, study, figure out what you want to do with your lives, but don't get under somebody and stay there because that's what society expects. And at the same time, she kept after me and telling me, you have to know the reason about justice because you have to be example for your sisters. Because when I call on them on doing the wrong things, and for her, wrong things were when we were not caring for people and the planet. That's how it was. And so she would say, when I call on you sisters and you have not been doing the correct way of living in being in harmony with the planet and harmony with, society in terms of the well-being of everybody, they're not going to pay attention to me. They're going to do what you do. So, they teach us character, integrity, a sense of justice. And that's why we are willing to die, because we cannot be schizophrenic that we know one thing and do something else. And so we are willing to do the past. But the other thing is that we know that, for example, in my case, Monsignor Romero asked me out of nothing. Well, he knew my work and all that. But, and I was leading work in the United States about what was happening in my country, relating it to what was going to Puerto Rico. Most people don't understand that to get to be in a situation such as we are now, they had to be a Puerto Rico. And if we don't understand the history of Puerto Rico, we are not going to understand how, situations happen that we are just like Puerto Rico, except that we are supposed to be independent. So I changed the word independent, in I-N, dependent, dependent from within. So this is the things that constantly we have to be looking at, why do we have the world that is being given to us and how are we going to be? So the important thing for us right now, for example, many things are being imposed in my country, El Salvador. And we say El Salvador is how it's known now, but our real name is Cuxcatan. The real name of Puerto Rico is Boriquen. And we go, Dominican Republic is Quisqueya. So knowing those things, and we also talk about the other nations as being our brother, sister nations. So we say, La Hermana República de Guatemala, and we go through that. So it's a consciousness issue also. And then under that consciousness, when Monsignor asked me to work with him, I told him, and with this, I want to finish this particular discussion at this moment. I told him, they are watching watching you, and one of these days they are going to kill you. And he told me, yes, but I am a man of God. I cannot just, give up. And I saw how he went through it. He went through it, and he just told me, but I said, look, they're going to kill some people that are close to you, like the man that opens the door of the archdiocese and the woman that takes care of the telephones. And can I work with them? He said, yes, as long as you don't confuse them and you don't lie to them, And then he went through it, but then I told him, I know that you have to go through this because at the level that you are, you have to have that character, that strength, that spirituality. But I don't choose that because I don't believe that martyrs are needed, but we need to transform. And he said, yes, that's okay. You see, and so we get into these discussions and analysis, and at this point we need them more than ever, Kumi, and that's why it's so good that we are having this.
Thanks, Marta, and thanks for reminding us that basically the struggle for justice, climate justice, economic justice, social justice, gender justice, and so on, are marathons and not sprints. And one of the most important things that we need to be sharing now with the current generation of activists is to get people to know that we are in for the long haul. Because right now, one of the challenges I find around the world when I look, especially in my own country and my own continent, Africa, activism is being challenged by well-being. Our well-being is being challenged. The individuals that work within movements and so on are being challenged in so many ways. But I just want to round up what came out of your presentation, which was really helpful, which is we have to be thinking about narratives, right? How we are shaping what we are asking for. Because I do think there is a problem with the way we talk and where people are, Sometimes it's a very big gap. Like I just give you a simple example. When I was at Greenpeace and I was occupying a rig in Greenland and carrying a sign that said "Stop Arctic Destruction." When I was released from prison, got back home to South Africa and was speaking to some kids in my family, and they said, Uncle Kumi, what a stupid slogan you were carrying. Stop Arctic Destruction? For us in Africa, that meant nothing, right? But if you put a slogan, Save Santa Claus Now, maybe we would have understood something, because that's the only association we have with that part of the world. And that might sound like a very light example, but if you think about what the child was saying, it was brilliant. Because sometimes as activists, we project our consciousness on the people that we're trying to mobilize, rather than doing enough to understand where they are and making sure that our narratives are connecting with their lived experience. So what this child was saying was, listen, the only association we have with that part of the world is that Santa Claus chills out there. And if you said that, that was a way of getting people to understand that the snow is melting and so on. So, but narratives is one thing. Then you also said we need to respect culture in the way we communicate. And I also think from your strong indigenous perspective, also I think we have to do more in the current moment of respecting ancient wisdom, looking at what we can draw from ancient wisdom. I'm constantly amazed at the proverbs and so on that comes from indigenous thought from centuries ago, where they warned us exactly about all the stuff that's going down now. There's a proverb from the Cree people, for example, in North America. It says, only when the last fish has been caught, the last tree has been chopped, the last river has been polluted, will humanity realize that we cannot eat money. So in this context of us struggling, and listen, I want to share with you all one of my heroes called Amilcar Cabral from the Guinea-Bissau, a small country in West Africa. He led the freedom struggle there against Portuguese colonialism. And he used to love to say, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. So we are in this to do everything we can to secure our children's future, right? And in that struggle, we don't have to be polite, but we have to position ourselves to win. And how do we win, Clare, which is my question to you, when, whether we're talking about the US, whether we're talking about the UK, or whether we're talking about Russia, it's just degrees of separation in terms of how bad the media environment is. Of course, Russia is on a different scale. But let's be very clear. The media environments in both the US and the UK and many other countries around the world is not conducive for us getting our message across. Like, for example, there are lots of examples where peaceful civil disobedience efforts, like, for example, in Canada, when there was the so-called Three Amigos meeting, you might remember, Marta, some 12 years ago, when it was a peaceful demonstration, thousands of people against the heads of Canada, US, and America. And the protest was going fine, and suddenly some guy comes there and he says, yes, no, we must fuck them up, and, kind of starting violence and so on. And guess what? It turned out within 48 hours, he was a paid employee of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He was an Asian provocateur. He went in there to mess it up and to turn the message of the... But turning to you, Clare, how do we deal with this? How can we get smarter at communicating why civil disobedience has to be taken, and how can we do it in a way that also does not alienate people that we need to win over onto our side? Sorry, there's a bit of a loaded question, but I'm sure you can take it. Over to you.
Well, so there's two things that I want to say. There's a lot of things, but there's two main things. One is that there was a survey taken in North America recently, I think earlier this year or late last year, which said that there was a certain percentage of people who were prepared to take civil disobedience, nonviolent action for the climate crisis. And it was enough, basically, by the theories of people like Erica Chenoweth saying, how many people do you need to be engaged in action to be able to reach a kind of a tipping point in a society? And so, one of the main things that I think Extinction Rebellion has helped to do is to kind of normalize the idea here of doing something en masse, which risks your personal freedom, which may result in arrest, which may result in you making yourself vulnerable in that way. And for me, at my age, I didn't grow up with like a big culture of lots of people sort of advocating that. It was like in pockets in the peace movement, in various different parts of the movements. But what I grew up with was certainly a type of activism that tried to avoid arrest, which tried to dance around the authorities and avoid engaging in the system in the way that we have with XR. And so there is something that I think in countries like ours now, which has been a little bit more normalized, and so it becomes socially kind of, well, lots of people do that, don't they? So I think don't underestimate how much that kind of Overton window shift has happened. But I think the other thing that you're asking question about, how to sort of be cleverer ourselves as a community of people in resistance, to see more clearly and to understand the world more clearly. I've kind of, in recent months, I've been working on a project to try and facilitate critical literacy learning with people in the movement. And I worked with this wonderful woman, Ma, from Peru, who has taught me like way more than I thought you could learn in a few months of, dialoguing and like planning some work together. But it's fascinating to me how you can learn some very simple techniques for people to kind of almost work a muscle of critical thinking, to strengthen your habit of questioning, of a route of questioning, of thinking, of going beyond a statement. And like, I love what you said, Marta, about independent, like means you're dependent inside yourself. You're like, it's people don't, people sometimes sort of do these workshops, and I think they feel a little like it's kind of discourse analysis, or like, we're very focused on the language or the words that we use and picking things apart, and is it really helpful? But it is, because a lot of what we do is communication, And like you're saying, you're holding up your sign. That's your communication on your action. For me, sometimes the communication is throwing the paint or, hitting the window with a hammer. That's the communication. It's like, this is how bad it is, guys. I just did that. And it speaks through the action. But a lot of it's in language, and we do have to reckon with the language and the lack of critical inquiry that's going on. So when you see the newspaper headlines, it's remarkable to me, even people inside your own sort of community, they could see a headline that's very bad about somebody in our movement. I won't name any names, but there's somebody who's had way more headlines than most. And they look at the headline and go, well, that's bad. But they don't go, I don't believe anything that newspaper writes. So let me think about why they're writing that and what's really going on. You know what I mean? But the scandal that comes through the newspapers can sometimes even capture people's friends and family. And they say, oh, no, I read that in that newspaper. That means you're very bad. But without thinking that the rest of the time, when they read something in that newspaper, they don't believe it. But there's a sort of an emotional draw to say, I don't like people writing bad things about our movement, so therefore this is bad. Rather than actually we have to stand up and say, this is absolute rubbish. This newspaper is rubbish, And so how do we get over that? Because that's a real complexity for me. Like, I don't know, but I think there's an educational and a co-educational thing about critical literacy and about critical learning together, which we have a lot to think about in our culture. And I hope that, because it can be actually really fun and quite inspiring to do this kind of learning, like together in small groups, that it's something that you can easily set up, easily teach, and then people can easily carry on. So can, ripple out. But to me, these things, it's a tender thing to think about how you can do things that can be well held and impactful, but also can scale or can ripple out in a way where you can see them making a difference on a bigger scale, because it's such a big task. And then the other thing on the media, I'll just say, is that I think certain people are looking at how to harness the influences that we have connections to, and think about the strategic use of them and their voices. So in a country where your media is dominated by vested interests, billionaires, people who buy politics, all of the stuff that I live with in Britain, the counter to that could, and we haven't tried it yet, but it could be a concert of support from people with very, very large audiences who say, no, what you're reading there is wrong. I'm with the people on the streets. So you think about how to orchestrate that, because you have a social media space where everything's random and it kicks off here, there, and everywhere. And we have, somebody with 1 million followers says, look at this guy chained to a goalpost. Isn't he brave? But if you had 50 people with 1 million followers who all lifted up that young activist who chained himself to a goalpost, and they did it all on the same day, all at the same time, they would make a much bigger wave, if you see what I mean, which would be much more sort of commensurate to the power of the corporate media. I'm not sure whether it will work, but it's an idea, I think.
Thanks, Clare. I mean, I absolutely think that's a kind of thinking that we need to engage in, because the two things I take from you, from those contributions, which are really helpful. One is, how do we invest and don't take it for granted that we all have learning to do. And I love the story you said about the friend from Peru, for example, because the context in which Marta and I grew up in, even though there's a big age difference between us as well, is very different from the context, that people young, like just the social media environment changes activism so much, right? And throws in new challenges. So I think the one thing I take is that we also have to recognize that all of us have to invest in our own personal learning, but the best learning we can engage in right now to be the smartest change agents we can be is when we do that learning in community, where we're cross-checking each other's experiences and so on. And the second point is, which I think is a very interesting way I will play it back to you. Essentially, what your second point is saying, let's get smart about disrupting the media environment, right?
Yeah,
and civil
totally.
disobedience is about disrupting the media environment. And perhaps, we have to make the distinction between whether media houses have the right to their own opinions, which is absolutely fine. We want diversity of opinion, but we cannot have the situation where media houses like Fox News and so on believe they have the right to their own facts. What Donald Trump's spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, said, we have alternative facts. Because, if you look at the situation in the US, how do we shift things there when about 35% of the people listen to Fox and other even more extreme right-wing sources and believe that that's reality, right? And here's the difficult question for us, and I'm coming to you on this, Marta. How do we deal with the people that voted for Trump, or the people that voted for Brexit, or the people that currently voted for an Italian fascist prime minister, and so on? Because are they simply the enemy of justice, or they are also victims in a way, in the sense that they were lied to? Because many of the people that voted for Brexit, for example, or voted for Trump, or who wanted to vote for Bernie if Bernie was the candidate at that time, Bernie Sanders, it was just they were fed up with the system ignoring their needs. Right? By the way, it's not true, I believe very strongly, to dismiss everybody who voted for Trump as racist, because if you go and look at the number of people that voted for Obama in the previous 2 elections and then voted for Trump, it's kind of shocking. And what is the answer to that, in my judgment, is that people are sick and tired of the establishment. They are sick and tired of being lied by both the mainstream parties in most countries around the world, and therefore they are seeking alternatives. And in the absence of progressive, well-organized alternatives, they are veering off in the direction that they are in many countries around the world, from Hungary to India to Brazil. Let's hope the second round in Brazil goes in a different way. But what's your sense on this, Marta?
Well, remember that I come looking from the bottom up. We have a saying, some of us, many of us in the social movements in Latin America at least, we say that in our compass, the North is the South, and the South is the global South. And in the world as it is now, the global South is 2/3 of the world at least. But then when we see the conditions in which the people in the global South are living, we see that the majority of them have experienced, colonial practices, which are still on, even though they are changing, adapting, And even the social media now is taking over, right? So there is right now a lot of disruptive to the people to be able to see. It's right there in front of them, but they cannot see it because the propaganda is such that, and because mostly, for example, in places like my country, the people have lived for 500 years, the majority of people, at least 4/5 of the population, in poverty and impoverishment. So they are fed up with having been nothing and nobody and being used because they have felt it all along. But now, somebody has paid attention and sees how to exploit that. And the hatred, they fund it as if people are still cooking with, fire at home, with leña, we call it wood. And so we have to find it like that, and like that. And the people are tired of having to live like that. But that is what is being done to them. Remember, all that thing can happen. And these are the ones that have created this mess to you. And they have stolen. And in the meantime, for example, the present administration in my country, they knew ahead of time that this pandemic was coming. They knew what was coming, and they used it to put us in confinement, to tell us if you get out, we are going to capture you. And then they even made a team, and they told us on TV, wash your hands. And if you're not doing it right, you're going to be taken to jail or whatever. And I am saying, but the people didn't have any water in their homes all this time since Columbus got lost. And how come we are asking and demanding this? And put that thing on your face. And the people are saying, why? What is going on? And we have to buy all that and stay home, and we are going to bring you a box of food. And then at the same time, these people are saying, for the first time, somebody's really caring for us. They used all that. They saw where we were. And so my friend that you know, Kumi, had to go to the UN. He didn't want to go. He said, because I don't really like how things go there, and I don't really want to go to the US. But we were hoping to get something happen for the situation of children and youth in our country, who are the majority in the population and are not being taken care of. So we had to do it. So people met with him and said, how do you like being in the United States? And he didn't answer, and I am translating. And then another one said, well, how do you like New York? And, 42nd Street and all that. And he didn't answer, And then a third one said, well, are you happy here? Are you enjoying it here? And I told him, either you say something because, I've been translating, and they probably thinking I'm just translating for you, even though I'm translating in front of them. So he said, you have too much entertainment here, too much distraction. And then they say, entertainment, distraction, like, TV and all that. No, too many things happening, because they say, what do you mean? Too many things happening. You don't know what's happening to yourselves. And you're not paying attention. And see, the people, this is happening. And so, for example, with what's happening in my country, they told us from the beginning, we are going to give you bitter medicine. We are going to take over. We are going to have, by the, in the next election, we are going to have the majority. And they planned it how they did it. And those of us who knew better, because it's very few of us that have had, by many of them, by sacrificing from our parents, some education, we opposed it. Oh, you're the opposition. We are going to lapidate us. That's how we were being treated. We are going to lapidate. And then I wrote to them, this that hated us. Rats, they called us. Thieves, like that, all of us. And then they were the ones that know. And so then, what does it mean to be lapidated? Do you know what lapidation means?
No.
I asked them, and they said, stone you to death.
Starve you to
death. You have to disappear by the next election. And how are we going to stone you to death? Not physically, but we are going to get you out. And we are still working. And we're still working. We have found out how. And when they imposed on us Bitcoin, we became experts on it. And when I came to the United States, the people didn't even know what Bitcoin meant.
So Bitcoin, just for people who don't know, the government that El Salvador has right now made as a big thing that they were going to make the national currency Bitcoin. So this was...
they did it already. They imposed on us.
And of course...
Yes, and we had it. That was the biggest march that we organized. Nobody wanted to pay attention to us, but when they understood what Bitcoin was, they were out on the march.
So, Marta...
with their signs, especially the women.
So, Marta, given what you were saying, and sadly, I can't believe it, it's almost on the hour now. Given what you are saying, suggests that we have to be much smarter at responding to divide and rule tactics from those with power. It's not new, it's always been there. We need to better understand the media environment that we're in. We need to do what Clare said, which is be creatively disruptive. And I think the question right now, many of us, and this is my last question to Marta, and I'll come to you with the same question, Clare. The reality is, for many of us have said, the system is broken, the system's not working. I mean, right now, I think we have to come to the painful conclusion that actually the system is working just fine. The system is working as it was designed to work, not to respect nature, to benefit the handful, at the top and give just about enough to certain people in the middle, so that they will defend the privilege of the folks at the top. And within that context, now there's a recognition from people in Extinction Rebellion to Black Lives Matter to the UN Secretary General and many, many institutions and networks and movements around the world, where people say either we need a new social contract or we need an eco-social contract. And my question to you is, given that there's a push for it from a range of quarters, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but this can happen at a national level, because social contracts are basically contracts between governments and the people, commitments that they make to the people, which they should be held accountable for. If you, Marta, had one, if let's say Antonio Guterres said to you, I have the power to allow you to write one clause in every constitution in every country, or in every country it'll be applied. What's the thing that you think is most precious that governments need to commit to their citizens right now? What would be that clause that you would want to see in such a contract between governments and citizens?
I think that, first of all, I have to make a clarification. Those social contracts have never been good to us.
Yes, exactly.
They have really just existed, just like, that
Exactly.
guy there is a guy, Leonard Cohen, that says this system is rigged, right?
Yes.
And it is rigged.
Yes.
And those of us who say it, the problem that we have is with the northern people, the global north, because they still don't understand that we're right, that the system is rigged, and it's been rigged all along. And so we cannot mend it. And why does anything that it exists, it should be so that we can live in peace with our family, in our community, in the planet. That we have to create everything for that purpose. But even the three, agendas, the 2015 agendas, they kind of say something about peace. But all that they are talking about is that we should be fine with a piece of peace. And this is never going to happen. And forever, we are not going to be, disruptive. We are going to struggle for our right to live in peace. It's a sacred life.
Thank you.
It's a sacred right. And so I hope that that's what we understand.
So, Marta, if I were to say that it is and many people are saying this, that one of the core responsibilities of government, a commitment that governments should make to the citizens, is to guarantee them a certain level of basic peace, stability, cohesion, and so on, which sadly is in decline virtually every country around the world. Either it's, extreme conflict like Russia and Ukraine, or it is violence and criminality where the state and governments are not able to respond. Thank you so much, Marta, for that. Claire, what would be your one clause in the social contract if you could wave a magic wand and you had the power to insist that every government should put that in? Marta is guaranteeing language around peace. What would you...
I don't know how to follow what Marta's just said, really.
It's hard.
But I guess, I would think about what seems to me to be the most likely practical way that you could do what Marta just described. And because we all know governments would say, yes, I'll give you that. And they never give you that.
Never give you that. Like the Green Climate Fund, for example.
So in XR, we advocate for citizens' assemblies, participatory democracy. And I think specifically on this conversation, it's about the element of sortition. And we were trying to think about ways to describe sortition. So for people who don't know what it is, it means like a lottery system. So you pick people by random selection, but you have some rules to make sure that you have something that's representative and fair. So if you have sortition, it's very hard to communicate to people why a random selection would be more useful or more fair than a non-random selection, or specialized people in politics or specialized people in their field. But actually, one of the things that we came up with, which I don't think we've used yet in our messaging, is that chance dissolves corruption. The way that you can like defend a structure against corruption is to imbued chance. And I think that's very simple to understand then, that you have random people come into government and into decision-making process. They're not lobbied, they're not vested interests, they don't get blackmailed, nobody knows who they are. They come in, they do some time of public service work, and then they get replaced. And then you have more people come in and they learn and they do their time in public service. And so for me, some commitment to sortition-based practices and processes to involve more people in decision-making, I think would be the most likely practical approach to get a government to actually deliver what Marta just described.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Claire. So if I could just say peace and participation, and let me say this, why participation and peace must go hand in hand, I think, as we move forward, is that even the CIA and the Pentagon, which I don't normally quote as major sources, I might add, but even they said in 2002 that the biggest threat to peace, security, and stability is not going to come from conventional threats or even terrorism, but will come from the threats of climate change and the impacts of climate change, which we are seeing right now. And that impact is also going to have a massive impact on mental well-being, right? And we see it with the young people, especially young girls who are asking horrific questions about should we be thinking about having kids and so on, which is horrific for our generation to hear that young people are having to go through those questions. And I think participation, which you push at citizen assemblies as a different way of thinking that can deliver better results, is not only going to be important, is my final concluding words in thanking you, for the purpose of trying to make impact on change and getting things to change. But I would go so far as saying that participation and working towards building peace is going to be part of our psychological resilience strategy to help those of us in the fight to have the courage to continue. And both of you have inspired so many people in different ways around the world. And Marta, we have an ally in Clare and many people like her in the global north who share the perspective as we do, and we're grateful for that. And we are equal comrades in a fight for equal justice for everyone in the world. And I'll end by saying that I know some days are hard. They're hard for me too when we look at what's happening around the world. But please know that your work inspires hundreds and thousands of people. And I thank you for the inspiration you've given to them and given to me. And thank you so much for being on Power, People, and Planet. Thank you so much.
Gracias. I really had a lot of fun with you.
Yes, we always do. Thank you. Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Marta.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining us for this discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And please share it, like it, do all that stuff that we need to do on it. But please share it because we want to inspire a conversation where we are saying that just as we say it cannot be business as usual, we also are bold enough to say that it cannot be activism as usual. So we are looking at ways in which we can be better, more strategic, more smarter. Thank you for joining.